The day my brother called to tell me that our mother had died, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't love her, but because, in truth, I had already grieved her years before. For the last decade, my mother, Helena, had slowly faded into someone I didn't recognize. Once warm and attentive, she had become distant, secretive, and, though I hated to admit it, cruel. The last time I saw her alive, 3 years ago, she had looked at me across her immaculate dining table and said, "Clara, sometimes children don't deserve what their parents worked for." I had gone home that night with tears blurring the road, wondering what I had done to deserve her contempt. So when my brother David called and said, "She's gone," my first feeling wasn't sadness. It was relief. And then, immediately after, guilt. "I'll handle the funeral arrangements," he said in that clipped, managerial tone he had inherited from her. "You just have to come." I hung up and stared at the framed photograph on my mantel, the one from my wedding 15 years ago. My mother stood next to David and his wife Simone, her arm around them, her smile bright and effortless. I was in the corner, half cropped out of the picture, holding a bouquet I had paid for myself. Even in photographs, I was an afterthought. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning. The kind of day when even the birds seemed too tired to sing. The church smelled of lilies and damp stone. David stood at the front in his tailored suit, every inch the grieving son. I sat 3 rows back, unnoticed, listening to the priest talk about kindness and forgiveness, words that seemed foreign to the woman in the coffin. After the service, David approached me outside the church. "She left a will," he said quietly. "I expected as much. The lawyer wants to read it tomorrow. 10 a.m. sharp." "Of course," I replied. "Wouldn't want to keep the inheritance waiting." He didn't even flinch. That was the thing about David, nothing ever cracked his polished calm.
The lawyer's office was exactly what I expected: mahogany furniture, heavy curtains, and the faint smell of dust and old money. Mr. Halvorsen, our family lawyer for decades, greeted us with the same solemn expression he had worn since I was a child. "Your mother was very specific in her instructions," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She revised her will just 6 months ago." David leaned forward. "Go on." Mr. Halvorsen cleared his throat. "To my son, David, I leave the family home, the vineyards, and all associated business assets." David smiled, almost imperceptibly. "To my daughter, Clara." There was a pause so long I thought he had lost his place. "I leave a box. Kept in the old storage room of the family estate. The key is in this envelope." He handed me a small, ivory envelope. "That's it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Mr. Halvorsen nodded. "Your mother left a personal note for you as well." He passed me another envelope, sealed in her neat handwriting. David stood. "Well, that settles that," he said briskly. "I'll have the property documents drawn up." I watched him leave with a mix of anger and numbness. He didn't even glance at me. A box. After years of distance, years of trying to win her affection, all I got was a box. That night, I drove to the estate. The once grand mansion sat at the edge of the vineyard like a fading ghost. The windows were dark, the roses wilted. It had been David's domain for years. Mother had moved in with him after father's death, leaving me with nothing but polite rejection. The storage room was in the east wing, behind a door I hadn't opened since I was a teenager. The smell of dust and varnish filled the air. In the far corner, beneath a faded quilt, sat a wooden chest with brass hinges. I inserted the key. It fit perfectly. Inside were stacks of letters tied with ribbon, and a leather-bound journal. On top was a small card that said, "For Clara. Because the truth belongs to you." My heart began to race. I took the box home before David could ask questions. That night, under the soft hum of my bedside lamp, I began to read. The journal began in 1986, the year before I was born. David is my golden child. He reminds me of his father, strong, intelligent, ambitious. Clara is different. Too quiet. Too much like me. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Sometimes I look at her and feel anger. As if she carries something that shouldn't exist. Something that shouldn't exist. The entries grew darker as the years passed. References to mistakes, to lies that can never come out. Then, on a page dated March 1990, my 3rd birthday, I found this. Every time I see Richard's eyes in Clara's face, I feel sick. I can't bear it. David must never know. Richard. Not my father's name. I flipped to the back of the journal, where a letter was folded inside. It was addressed to my mother from someone named Richard. Helena. You can't just erase what we had. You can't pretend Clara isn't mine. If you ever tell her otherwise, I will go to your husband. She deserves the truth. I sat frozen. The walls around me seemed to tilt. All my life, I had wondered why my mother loved David more. Why she looked at me with that distant, painful expression. Now I knew. The next morning, I drove back to the estate. David was in the garden, barking orders at the workers like a small-time dictator. I found something, I said. He didn't even turn around. I'm sure it's sentimental. David, listen to me. I'm not father's daughter. That got his attention. He turned, frowning. What nonsense is this? Mother's journal. Letters. Everything. She had an affair before I was born. My real father's name was Richard. He stared at me as if I had sprouted horns. Then, slowly, a cruel smile spread across his face. Well, that explains a lot. Excuse me? You never fit in, Clara. You never belonged. Now it all makes sense. His words hit harder than any physical blow. You think this is funny? I asked, my voice trembling. I think it's ironic, he said, lighting a cigarette. You spent your life trying to earn her approval, and it turns out you weren't even hers to love. I walked away before he could see me cry. But as I reached my car, something inside me hardened. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt powerful. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my mother's handwriting. You carry something that shouldn't exist. By dawn I had made a decision. If I truly was Richard's daughter, then I wanted to know who he was. The journal mentioned an old photograph she kept, hidden in the attic where David will never look. So that morning I drove back to the estate again. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, flashlight in hand, dust swirling in the beam. Old trunks and boxes towered like forgotten monuments. Near the far wall, wrapped in brown paper, I found a framed photograph. I tore off the paper. A tall man in his 30s smiled at the camera, arm around my mother. He had pale green eyes, my eyes. On the back, in fading ink, R and H, Paris 1985. R for Richard. Paris, the trip she had always claimed was a conference. As I stood there trembling, I heard footsteps below. Clara? David's voice. I froze. He appeared at the top of the stairs, cigarette dangling, eyes narrowing when he saw what I was holding. So it's true, he murmured. You found him. I clutched the photo. You knew? He shrugged. Mother told me years ago. Said it was best if you never found out. The room spun. You knew I wasn't father's daughter and you never told me? He smiled thinly. Why would I? It benefited me. You were always the outsider. Something in me cracked. You're vile. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. And you're a fool if you think this changes anything. The estate is mine. The company is mine. You get your little box and your little secrets. That's it. I took a step back, my mind racing. If he knew, and Mother had still left me that box, maybe she wanted me to use what was inside. Maybe the truth wasn't meant to destroy me, but him. That night I spread the rest of the letters across my kitchen table. At the bottom of the chest was a hidden false panel. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents. I unfolded them carefully: bank statements, wire transfers, and notarized papers bearing both my mother's and David's signatures. The numbers made my heart stop. Over $500,000 had been moved from the Vineyard's corporate account into one labeled Helena Richter Charitable Foundation. Only there was no such foundation. Attached was a handwritten note. David insisted I sign these to avoid taxes. But I know he's been moving money offshore. If something happens to me, the account records are in the blue folder. Clara must see them. A surge of cold fury replaced the sadness. David hadn't just manipulated her, he'd stolen from her. And maybe, just maybe, her death hadn't been as natural as everyone believed. 2 days later I visited Dr. Miller, the coroner who had handled Mother's case. I told him I wanted a copy of the report for closure. He hesitated. "Are you sure you want to see that?" "I'm sure." He handed me the file. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Contributing factors: high sedative levels, diazepam. Was she on medication? I asked. She had a prescription, but the dosage found was high. Could be accidental. Or not. I drove straight to Simone's boutique, where she was arranging dresses in the window. "Where's David?" "At the estate, I think." "Why?" "Because I'm going to ask him what he mixed into Mother's tea before she died." Simone's face drained of color. "Clara, don't. You don't know what..." The drive back to the estate felt endless. The vineyards looked different that afternoon, every vine a silent witness, every leaf whispering the same word in my head: murder. When I arrived, David was in Mother's study, sorting through papers that didn't belong to him. I didn't bother knocking. "Did you poison her?" He looked up, startled for the briefest second, then scoffed. "That's an ugly word. You gave her diazepam." I tossed the coroner's report on the desk. Enough to knock down a horse. He leaned back in the leather chair, studying me. "Do you have proof?" "I have this." I held up the folder of offshore accounts. "And her note saying you made her sign fake papers. If I show this to the police, they'll open the case again." For the first time, he looked rattled. "You don't understand, Clara." She was losing her mind. She begged me to help her sleep. She begged you for peace, and you gave her death. He slammed his fist on the desk. "Stop pretending you cared. You hated her." "I hated what she became," I said. "But I never stopped being her daughter." "Can you say the same?" His jaw tightened. "You're not her daughter." The words sliced through me, but instead of pain, I felt something cold and clear. "You're right," I said quietly. "And that's exactly why you should be very afraid of me." That night I made my move. I scanned every document and emailed copies to a lawyer friend in the city with a simple note. "If anything happens to me, send this to the police." Then I called David. "Meet me at the Vineyard office tomorrow at noon. Alone. I'll give you everything back, the letters, the evidence, all of it. But I want one thing in return." He hesitated. "What?" "A written confession that you falsified Mother's finances. No mention of her death. Just the embezzlement. Do that, and I disappear forever." He laughed, thinking he was still in control. "Fine." Noon. The next day the sky was the color of iron. I arrived early, hid a small voice recorder under the desk, and waited. He came right on time, immaculate as ever, arrogance radiating off him. "Where's the confession?" I asked. He waved a sheet of paper. "Signed and ready. Now give me the documents. First, answer one question. Why did you do it?" He smirked. "Because she deserved it. She let Father rot while she spent his money playing saint. I just took what should have been mine." "And the pills?" He shrugged. "She was tired. I helped her rest. The air left my lungs. He said it so casually, as if he were discussing pruning vines. Thank you, I whispered. For what? For confessing. I reached under the desk, stopped the recorder, and slid it into my pocket. He realized too late what I'd done. You little. Careful, I said, standing. There's more than one copy. He lunged for me, but I was faster. I ran, slamming the office door behind me and sprinting to my car. Gravel sprayed as I drove away, his voice echoing behind me, full of hatred and fear. 2 weeks later, David was arrested. Fraud. Forgery. Manslaughter under investigation. The recorder had done its job. So had the documents. I didn't attend the hearings. I didn't need to see him beg. I had already seen the worst parts of him, the parts that looked too much like Mother. The vineyard was frozen by the court's pending investigation, but I didn't want it anyway. I sold my apartment, packed my things, and drove south until the air smelled of salt and the sea stretched like freedom before me. I rented a small cottage in a coastal town where no one knew the Richter name. For months I woke up before dawn and walked the shore barefoot, letting the waves erase my footsteps as quickly as I made them. It felt right, starting over every morning. One evening, sorting through the last items from Mother's box, I found a letter I'd somehow missed. Clara. If you ever learn the truth, know this, I did love you. But every time I looked at you, I saw my own sin. Forgive me if you can. And live freely, something I never managed. I sat there for a long time, the ocean wind fluttering the paper. For the first time, I felt something close to forgiveness, not for her, not yet, but for myself. 2 years later. I never changed my last name. Not because I was proud of it, but because erasing it would have meant erasing the woman I used to be, the one who survived. Sometimes I get letters from the lawyer. Updates. David was sentenced to 12 years. He'll serve maybe 8. Simone divorced him within months. The estate is being auctioned off next spring. The proceeds, ironically, will go to a real charitable foundation, one I started in my mother's name to support women reclaiming their lives after family exploitation. I visit the vineyards once a year. The new owner lets me walk among the rows. I always stop at the eastern slope, where the sun hits the grapes first. That's where my mother used to stand every morning, watching the light rise over everything she thought she controlled. I close my eyes, breathe in the scent of soil and rain, and whisper to her memory. You were right, Mother. Children don't always deserve what their parents worked for. But some of us learn to grow our own harvest. Then I turn back toward the horizon, where the sea glitters like a promise.